Welcome back to the next session of the Mexican-American War. Here we get into more of the details of battle, conflicts, and who led them and who commanded them. Winfield Scott was the commander of the U.S. Army at the time when the battle took place, the War of Mexico, but he made a very interesting point about the fact when he looked upon the Mexican War. As he stated in there, I give as my fixed opinion that but for our graduated cadets, the war between the United States and Mexico might, and probably would have, lasted some 4 or 5 years. Within its first half, more defeats and victories falling to our share. Whereas, in less than 2 campaigns, we conquered a great country and a peace without loss of a single battle or skirmish. And General Scott would know that. 1841, General Winfield Scott was chosen the overall commander for the United States Army in the fight against Mexico. Winfield had a long history. Born in 1786 and passing away in 1866, Scott was one of the most important American military figures of the early 19th century. After fighting the Niagara frontier in the War of 1812, Scott pushed for a permanent army that adhered to the standards of professionalism. In 1821, Scott wrote the General Regulations for the Army, the first comprehensive systematic set of military bylaws that set standards for every aspect of a soldier's life. Scott also later unsuccessfully ran for president as a Whig Party nominee in 1852. Later, his Civil War tactics were originally derided when the American Civil War started up, but eventually his tactics became part of the Union's successful strategy. In many ways, the United States was fortunate in having Scott as commander of the U.S. forces in Mexico. Given his professional background and proven track record of his abilities, Scott was a key man in charge who commanded the respect of his troops, as well as the politicals in Washington who, as many politicals tended to do, also served as armchair generals. So while Scott served as the overall commander, the lead U.S. fighter in the war fell to Zachary Taylor. Taylor was born to a prominent family of plantation owners who moved westward from Virginia to Louisville, Kentucky in his youth. He was later commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army in 1808 and made a name for himself as a captain in the War of 1812. He climbed the ranks establishing military forts along the Mississippi River and entered the Black Hawk War as a colonel in 1832. His success in the Second Seminole War attracted national attention and earned him the nickname of Old Rough and Ready. He was noted for his somewhat uncouth, unpretentious ways, plain clothing, and plain speaking. And thus Taylor was noted as being his own man. Despite being a Southerner and a slave owner himself, Taylor did not push for the expansion of slavery. And later, while briefly serving as U.S. President, Taylor sought sectional harmony among all those concerns. His independence streak would later on appear during the course of the war when, following his crushing defeat of the Mexican army in the Battle of Buena Vista, he was removed from command by President Polk for fear of Taylor overshadowing Polk. Despite this, Taylor remained very popular and later on was readily elected U.S. President. But there's more in the background we have to talk about prior to the Mexican War taking place. You see, before the Mexican War took place, the U.S. tried to buy some Mexican territory directly. In late 1845, President Polk sent diplomat John Slidell on a secret mission to Mexico. Slidell was tasked with settling a long-standing disagreement about the border between the two countries, the area we know of Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico. But Slidell was also authorized to offer Mexicans up to $25 million for territories in Mexico and California, which are translated to pretty serious money today. But when the Mexicans refused to consider the offer, and actually Mexico refused to meet with Slidell, it was a matter of Mexican national honor to even discuss the sale of any of the land. Polk then upped the ante by ordering 4,000 troops under Zachary Taylor to occupy the disputed land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, a region Mexico claimed as its own territory. Thus, Mexico replied by sending troops to the disputed zone, and on April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a patrol of American dragoons. Polk's opponents would later argue the president had goaded the Mexicans to a fight, most notably Abraham Lincoln, who asked Polk to point out on a map where this battle actually took place, to which Polk never answered. But nevertheless, on May 13, 1846, Congress voted to declare war on Mexico by an overwhelming margin. But there's another aspect to this as well. In all political disputes, there are no innocents. Then President of Mexico, Santa Anna, used the war to reclaim power in Mexico and secure his own position. Most Americans considered Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna a mortal enemy for his actions at the 1836 Battle of the Alamo. But the charismatic general returned to power during the Mexican-American War thanks to a surprising ally, U.S. President James Polk. See, Santa Anna was languishing in Cuba, exiled from his country, when the war began, having been driven to exile after a stint as Mexico's dictator. In August 1846, Santa Anna convinced the Polk administration that he would negotiate a favorable peace if he were allowed to return home through an American naval blockade of Mexico. So Polk took the general at his word, but shortly after setting foot on Mexican soil, Santa Anna double-crossed the Americans and organized troops to fight off the invasion. Along with reclaiming the presidency, Santa Anna went on to personally lead the Mexicans in nearly all the war's major battles. Meantime, on the borders between Mexico and Texas, Mexican General Jose Mariano Martin Buenaventura Ignacio Nepomuceno Garcia de Arista Noes was originally an officer in the Spanish Army. Later, Arista joined the Revolutionary Army of Agustin de Iturbide, the first and last emperor of Mexico, and served under Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna during the attempt to put down the 1836 Texas Rebellion. In 1846, Arista was given command of the Army of the North and sent to expel American troops from territory claimed by the Mexican government in Texas. The resulting engagement ignited the bloody Mexican-American War. Arista was command of the Mexican forces during the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, where he was defeated largely due to superior U.S. artillery. Personally quite brave, Arista was a dedicated Republican, a member of Mexico's liberal faction, and therefore the natural enemy of his largely conservative staff. At both the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, Arista was ill-served, distracted by a political division among his staff. This probably largely led to his defeat at both battles. After Resaca de la Palma, Mexico's government recalled Arista and he was removed from command. He requested a court-martial and was absolved of guilt for the defeats at both battles, and for the rest of the war, he served only as a functionary, seeing little combat. Now, the first major battle of the Mexican-American War took place at Palo Alto, not far from the U.S.-Mexican border in Texas. By May of 1846, a series of skirmishes had flared into all-out war. Mexican General Mariano Arista laid siege to Fort Texas, knowing the American General Zachary Taylor would have to come and break the siege. And then Arista laid a trap, picking the time and place the battle would take place. Arista, however, did not count the new American flying artillery, which would be the deciding factor in the battle. The Battle of Palo Alto was fought at a small site in southeastern Texas, about 9 miles northeast of Matamoros, on an open range. Mexican troops had crossed the Rio Grande, besieged Fort Brown, and to threaten Zachary Taylor's supply center. Taylor had his army met the invaders at Palo Alto with superior artillery, the so-called flying artillery we spoke of earlier in the session. Despite the greater numbers and crack cavalry units of the Mexican army, commanded by General Arista, the Mexicans suffered heavier casualties. Disheartened by the lack of success, they retired the next day to defensive position further south. Taylor then continued a slow march to Mexico. Although strong-minded, Taylor was no fool. Advancing to enemy territory is a risk unto itself, and thus Taylor marched forward, ensuring supply lines were well protected by establishing garrisons and forts along the way, all the while gathering intelligence and, above all, a solid geographical understanding of what waited for him ahead. The next day, Arista would try again. At the Battle of Resaca de la Palma on May 8th, Taylor moved roughly 2,000 American reinforcements, The Mexican force numbered 4,000 to 5,000 troops. Rista laid an ambush along a creek bed. It was a great deal of dense vegetation. He planned the poor visibility, limiting the effectiveness of the American artillery. It worked. The American artillery advantage was nullified. Still, determined to push the Mexican army back to the Mexican border, Taylor ordered an attack through the thick brush within the creek bed. Against the concentrated American attack, the Mexican lines did not hold up against a determined assault, and the Mexican army is forced to retreat to Monterrey. And thus begins Taylor's slow but inevitable march to Mexico. Taylor continued his slow march in the Mexican South, careful to protect his supply lines. Monterrey held a key spot in the territories of north and central Mexico. Meanwhile, Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia had heavily fortified the city of Monterrey in anticipation of a siege. Taking Monterrey would be no easy feat. It was rather well fortified by 2 reinforced buildings, fortresses, and positions on opposite ends of the city. Taking one would only leave any other attacker open to attack by the other fortress. But rather than risk a long-term siege, Taylor did the unusual. He simultaneously attacked both fortresses, breaking from conventional warfare and taking the city by surprise. The heavily fortified Mexican positions had a weakness. They were too far apart from one another to offer mutual support. Taylor defeated them one at a time, and on September 24, 1846, the city of Monterrey surrendered. But during this battle, Monterrey did not go down easily. The street fighting was tough and demanding, resulting in higher American casualties. Both the Mexican army and the Mexican people were not readily giving up. After Monterrey, Taylor pushed southwards, making as far as a little bit south of Saltillo. Here he paused because many of his troops were to be reassigned to a planned separate invasion of Mexico from the Gulf of Mexico, a move which President Polk undertook just beyond the need of an invasion. Mexican General Antonio de Santa Anna decided on a bold plan. Santa Anna would attack the weakened Taylor instead of turning to meet this new threat. The Battle of Buena Vista was a fierce battle, and probably the closest the Mexicans came ever to winning an entire war. It was during this battle that St. Patrick's Battalion, a Mexican unit comprised of defectors from the American Army, first made a name for itself, but we'll learn about them in the time ahead. In the meantime, the Battle of Buena Vista was not intended to happen. The battle came about because American politics reared its ugly head. As Taylor, whose political alignment was unknown, had become a national hero, President Polk, a Democrat, became concerned about the general's political ambitions. As a result, Polk ordered Taylor to stand fast in northeastern Mexico while ordering Major General Scott to attack Veracruz before advancing on Mexico City. To support Scott's operation, Taylor's army was stripped of the bulk of its forces. Upon learning that Taylor's command had been reduced, Santa Anna marched north with 22,000 men with the goal of crushing the Americans, as Taylor was left with only 5,000 or so troops. Attacking at the Battle of Buena Vista on February 23, 1847, Santa Anna's men were repulsed with heavy losses. Mounting tenacious defense, Taylor's 4,700 men or so were able to hold, though they were badly stretched. Once again, it was the effective application of flying artillery, coupled with a good tactical knowledge of the terrain, which enabled the Americans to prevail. Knowing the landscape, coupled with the application of rapidly placing artillery at close range and advancing forces, overcame the numerical superiority of the Mexican army. The victory of Buena Vista further enhanced Taylor's national reputation, but marked the last fighting he would see during the conflict. Known as Old Rough and Ready for his gruff demeanor and unpretentious attire, Taylor had largely remained silent on his political beliefs. Leaving his army in November 1847, he handed command to Brigadier General John Wool and quietly returned home, laying the groundwork for the very thing Polk feared, a presidential run for the Whig Party. Despite it being a very close battle and potentially military disaster, American forces prevailed at Buena Vista. And now the stage was set for the next coming battle, Veracruz, where the first time the American Army conducted a surprise invasion by way of the sea, landing troops for an amphibious operation that nobody had expected. There are more battles yet to come. See you next week.